CGI faces. Anyone who's been keeping up with franchise slop over the last decade or so is aware of them. Using modern technology to bring iconic and beloved characters back to the screen. It can bring out a whole range of emotions from the audience, from shock at seeing a character you recognise, to nostalgia at seeing a character you recognise. But for me, pretty much without fail, the emotion it brings out is disgust, which I think is an emotion. I don't want to see it, and I'd like to dive into why. I'd like to clarify that I'm not talking about using CGI to create characters like Gollum or Thanos or the Na'vi. I mean your bog standard human faces, but ones that don't exist anymore, whether that's due to death or just the passage of time. There are a few different types of computer-generated human, and I'm going to give some examples and explain why I'd like them all to stop. Obviously there are technical differences in how this stuff is achieved. You've got your deepfakes, your motion capture with a CGI model, your virtual facelifts, but the distinctions I'm interested in talking about are less about the tech and more about the context. The first type I want to talk about is probably the most common, and it's de-aging. Taking an actor of a certain age and making them look younger for a role. The reason it's the most common is because Disney seemed to force it into every Marvel movie for a few years so they could refine it. And to be fair, it has come a long way since the tech was first utilised. It can sometimes be really good, but the progression of its realism doesn't seem to be a linear thing. It can go from good to bad from year to year, sometimes even in the same project. When de-aging is at its best, you do get the sense that the full performance of the actor has been captured. You're not so much looking at a fake face, but a slightly altered one. The problem is that a lot of the time, it's not really at that level. The extra layer of artifice can act as a real barrier to your investment. No matter how good it is, I tend to find myself spending more time assessing how it looks in any given scene than losing myself in the story. Sometimes a director like Martin Scorsese is doing such incredible storytelling that your immersion does survive the tech, but unfortunately there aren't many people who can do what Marty does. There's another kind of CGI human that often gets lumped in with de-aging because it's making young versions of actors who are still alive, like 80s Mark Hamill in the Disney Plus Star Wars shows and 70s Carrie Fisher in Rogue One. But unlike normal de-aging, the actors whose likenesses we're seeing have nothing to do with it. Carrie Fisher had no involvement with Leia's Rogue One portrayal, and as much as Mark Hamill pretends to be involved with The Mandalorian, it really doesn't look like anything from his reference footage actually makes it into the finished product. This isn't about taking an actor and making them look younger, it's about creating a young version from scratch. It involves another actor or body double being given someone else's face and lip-syncing to archive audio, or in a more recent development, an AI-generated text-to-speech voice made up of archive recordings. That's what you're hearing with Luke in the Mandoverse and Vader in the Kenobi series. Technology-wise, it's way closer to what they do to bring dead actors to the screen, except I guess a little less disturbing. Let's talk about that. Taking someone who's passed away and putting them in a movie. Or finishing their role in a movie. One of the best examples of the latter was Paul Walker in Furious 7. He died when they were midway through filming, and they used all the tricks and technology at their disposal to complete the film. They rewrote and restructured a good chunk of the narrative, used archive footage, and created a digital Brian using Walker's brothers as body doubles. To me, this feels like one of the most justifiable uses of this tech that's ever happened. He'd not only signed up to appear in the film, he'd recorded a decent amount of it. If they hadn't been able to put his scenes into context, his final performance would have just been scrapped. It's not always seamless, in fact I'd say it's rarely unnoticeable, but it doesn't really matter. It's still a really successful end product that honours Paul Walker and Brian very effectively, but my positive feelings towards it are very much dependent on the circumstances that led to it. They were given an impossible situation and handled it as well as they could. Similar things have happened across multiple projects that lost cast members during production. Although Carrie Fisher hadn't filmed anything for Star Wars Episode 9 when she died, she was definitely signed on to be part of it. To put her in the film, they used archive footage of deleted scenes to slot her into the action, writing new context for all her lines. There's more of a discussion to be had there about whether they should have just let her rest and kept the character off screen, either with an unseen death or some side mission. For what it's worth, I don't love the execution, but I can at least see why they made the decision to involve the character and Fisher's likeness in the story. With a lot of other examples of CGI resurrections, actually most of them, that justification is way less applicable. They put Brando in Superman Returns despite it being a reboot that recast everyone else. They put Laurence Olivier in Sky Captain and the World of Tomorrow because they wanted to. But the first one I remember was Audrey Hepburn in an advert for Galaxy Chocolate. There's something so directly commercial about that one that always makes my skin crawl. Obviously, there's a financial element to all of these other examples, but specifically using a dead person to sell a product is just kind of gross. Luckily, I'm immune to that kind of influence. But you worry about everyone else. The example that really stands out to me though is Rogue One, when they brought back Peter Cushing's Grand Moff Tarkin. Unlike previous examples, he wasn't obscured on a screen or a projection, and he wasn't silently sitting there to sell us chocolate. He's a walking, talking character who plays a major role in the scenes he's in. Being such an early example of this tech being featured prominently, it's quite an interesting one. It actually has way more in common with a classic Andy Serkis mocap performance than some of the modern instances. They hadn't developed the type words into a computer and have 1983 Luke Skywalker say them machine back then, so there's a reliance on a real actor doing a real performance. And Guy Henry genuinely does a great job embodying the voice and physicality of the character, to the point where you kind of wonder why didn't they just let him play the role without any digital alterations. There's the argument that because it's such a direct prequel to A New Hope, it has to be seamless, but I don't know. Captain Antilles is very clearly a different man, General Dodonna never used to look so much like the grandpa from Dairy Girls, and Genevieve O'Reilly is not identical to the original Mon Mothma, but she's remarkable and has since brought the character to a whole new plane of depth and development in Andor. Who knows, we might be having a very different conversation about Guy Henry's Tarkin if we'd actually been able to see it. But any discussion of that performance is buried, maybe justifiably, under the very disturbing fact that he's wearing a dead man's face. Because it's pretty messed up, right? I mean, legally they got the permission they needed from Cushing's estate, but when he died, was he really in a position to say, oh, don't recreate me with technology that doesn't exist yet? I don't think he was. I don't know, it's an ethical question that maybe warranted a bit more of a discussion. But they were busy making and remaking a mid-tier Star Wars movie, probably too worried about whether they could pull it off technically to really consider whether they should. It was admittedly fairly uncharted territory, but I think it should have prompted a broader conversation. Instead, it very quickly led to a blanket acceptance of this tech and opened the floodgates to a whole new wave of digital necromancy. Who are you going to call to solve this problem when even the Ghostbusters have succumbed to it? 2021's Ghostbusters Afterlife was an embarrassing Lego sequel whose worshipping of the source material made The Force Awakens look positively irreverent, which is hilarious given that its source material is just a grimy comedy about exterminators. But the most laughably sickly attempt to rinse nostalgic emotion from the climax was the appearance of Egon Spangler, to silently emote at the goodies during the film's climax. The moment starred a CGI Harold Ramis, not how he actually looked in his later years, but slimmed down a little, how he should have looked. And based on the response, it was exactly what the fans wanted to see. And who could forget this very year, the greatest superhero movie of all time, The Flash. That movie's climax ground to a ridiculous halt for 5 minutes so everyone could look at things that we remember from the past. They chucked in the digital likenesses of Christopher Reeve, Adam West, and George Reeves so everyone could clap and point and wave their Funko Pops in appreciation. This phenomenon isn't going to end anytime soon, nor does there really seem to be much of a call for it. It feels like the return of the original Star Wars trio is an inevitability, and I'm sure it's only a matter of time before the tech is affordable enough for other franchises to use or abuse. There's talk of making a film starring James Dean, who died in 1955, not because they're bringing back one of his iconic characters, just because they thought he should be the lead in a brand new movie. Here's a suggestion from me. Don't. Do a different thing. That applies to all of this shit. I think it's a horrifying precedent that you can be long dead, but the ghoulish desires of nerds, studios, and filmmakers can pull you out of the ground and shove you into your Superman costume for a cameo in the worst movie ever made. We shouldn't put up with this, and we certainly shouldn't be cheering for it. It's not something that should be the norm. People shouldn't be excitedly speculating about the potential return of characters played by actors who are long dead. I don't think this is just a matter of personal preference here. It's not just that I think it tends to look awful, which I do. More than ever, I feel there's a moral component to this that fuels my preferences into something very passionate. It takes me to a level of frustration I rarely reach when it comes to disagreeing about media. I saw someone saying, oh, wouldn't it be great to see Leia in the next episode of Ahsoka? We already have the CGI model from Rogue One. And I just can't shake the overwhelming desire to say, fuck off. Turn off your stupid fucking fan brain and think for a moment about the real fucking world. You might be saying, J-Boi, I understand this sentiment when it comes to dead actors, but surely if someone gives their permission, then it's all okay. And I'm afraid to say that the answer is no, because there's someone they still forgot to ask. Me. Harrison Ford was fully in support of the de-aging in Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. He was even involved. And it sucked. His eyes were dead, his skin was rubber, and sometimes he didn't even have a neck. I don't like to look at it. And it's an extended sequence, they were clearly happy with it. But I was just pretty miserable that so much time was being wasted on pretending a computer-generated imposter was the real Indiana Jones on a classic adventure. You look at the behind-the-scenes footage, and Harrison Ford, the genius of face acting, is pulling some incredible comedic expressions that just get completely lost in the translation into to fake Indy. It was the final Indiana Jones movie starring Harrison Ford, and I just wanted to skip ahead and get to the real guy. And that's not something I feel when I watch the start of The Last Crusade. So it's not the Kathleen Kennedy sentiment of, oh, there's no Indy without Harrison. I guess my stipulation isn't that Indiana Jones needs to be Harrison Ford, just that he needs to be human. That's a decent stipulation to have for most characters, actually. The issues I have here apply to practically every previous example. It's just that something like the young Tony Stark scene in Captain America Civil War lasts for less than 2 minutes, but the opening flashback of Indy 5 is 22 minutes long. I guess these issues and questions matter more now because filmmakers are getting the confidence to implement this concept on a much larger scale. I think there's quite often a dishonesty to it. Obviously, all storytelling is full of trickery and manipulation, but there are so many people who think James Earl Jones actually voiced Vader in the Kenobi series, or that robot Luke Skywalker is simply a de-aged Mark Hamill. It's fair to think that because you'll find both of them in the credits where all the actors are. And maybe people should be credited for the use of their likeness, but it still feels like studios are more than happy to let audiences believe that these actors were more involved than they were. In the behind-the-scenes promo, you'll always hear this anti-recast sentiment of, we knew we couldn't do it without the original actor. And I don't know if they're lying through their teeth or just bamboozled by the tech, but they very much are doing it without the original actor. Take Luke Skywalker, they've recast him with a body double, an animated face, and a synthesized voice. This separation from actual 1980s Mark Hamill, for me at least, comes with all the downside of a traditional recast, but none of the humanity. All of these examples are recasts. It's incredible that they've kind of managed to trick people into thinking they're not. Peter Cushing wasn't in Rogue One, Harold Ramis wasn't in Ghostbusters Afterlife, and James Dean isn't going to be the star of any future movies, as much as the people making and some of the people watching the films are trying so hard to believe. Part of me thinks or hopes that this is just your Jim Mangold's, Dave Filoni's and Jon Favreau's not being able to resist having the real Luke Skywalker from the olden days or the real Indiana Jones or Superman in their stuff now that it's considered possible. They definitely do seem oblivious to reality when it comes to this tech, so blinded by their ghoulish fantasies that they can't seem to actually use their brains. The way Favreau talks about this stuff is just fucked, and that mentality could be the reason we're seeing so much of this tech. But there's a potentially more sinister explanation. Disney especially seems to be pushing this technology so heavily. There's a theory that they're deliberately aiming to have less of a reliance on the actor part of acting, cutting out the middleman by relying entirely on the as yet ununionized VFX workers. I say it's a theory, but it's a thing that's definitely happening across all of Hollywood. The only question is to what extent. If you get Graham Hamilton to stand there and lip sync to text-to-speech Mark Hamill while a YouTuber slaps a PNG of Luke on his face, there's no risk of creating a movie star. He'll never age out of the role or demand better pay or any kind of creative input because you can just replace him with a different vessel for the nostalgia machine. We've already been hearing about instances of people's faces being scanned as part of background acting work, their likenesses being signed away for indefinite use by the studio without much informed consent. It's one of SAG's concerns with the current strike, and I think most living actors are concerned about how their voices and faces could be used without their control. It's happening from the small scale of AI music covers to more serious examples of misinformation. There's a not unreasonable fear of being replaced. Digital human face technology, along with voice synthesizing, is only going to get better. It's already come an incredibly long way. It's not like this is a new idea, it's just that it's only recently reached a point where they've decided it's an acceptable thing to put in front of an audience. But I don't think it's at that point, and the optimistic part of me believes it never will be, because I'm not sure it really ever should be. In 2004, George Lucas was saying that it would never happen.
You're not going to get an artificial intelligence computer that's neurotic enough to be able to understand how you create a performance. Performance is an art.
But that was nearly 20 years ago. Who knows what he'd say now? We've spoken about the distinction between an actor giving a performance with a CG face and something that's almost entirely AI generated. But it seems that nerd fans and nerd filmmakers are way more interested in accuracy than humanity. So they'd never compromise for a voice that wasn't quite right in exchange for a real performance. Which is funny though, because I actually don't remember Luke having such dead eyes in the original trilogy. I'm sure you've noticed from the behind the scenes footage I've been showing, but Graham Hamilton looks as much like Luke Skywalker as the deepfake they slap over his face. And who remembers Anthony Ingruber, who they always said was a perfect young Harrison Ford? Well, good news, he was sometimes the guy they put under all the CG for young Indiana Jones in Dial of Destiny. Isn't that what we all wanted? Obviously, the answer is no. I want to connect to the human being that's on the screen, look into a pair of real eyes and see real emotion. I don't want to be taken out of a story every second by noticing the faintest animated micro-expression that set off my "this is not real" alarm. As George Lucas said, performance is an art. Portraying a human involves involves actual humanity. I want actors to be able to give breathtaking performances using their real faces and voices. If we desperately need legacy stories with familiar actors for nostalgic nerds to cheer and cry and post weepy reaction videos about, it's possible to be creative. Doctor Who always seems to find a way to just let returning actors be as old as they are. Star Trek did a similar thing with Leonard Nimoy. These characters don't have to just be preserved in resin as their most iconic forms. But if we want to see them younger, it's hard to fathom such an apparent aversion to recasting when it's led to so much great stuff over the years. For a lot of people, their favourite portrayal of a character isn't by the person who originated the role. It feels like people perceive recasts as unimaginable until they've actually happened. They're perfectly happy to watch those stories play out, but don't do any more because it would never work. Recasts can be incredible, but this doesn't mean that they should instantly go and recast every popular character so they can keep retelling the same stories forever. Ideally, these franchises shouldn't even have to get into a situation where they need to put a human on screen that doesn't exist anymore. They can push forward, tell new stories with new characters, let actors shine and define brand new roles for future generations to get attached to. Quite frankly, there are so many options that can work well. Just please stop showing me CGI humans. I'd love to get your opinion on this stuff. Is this something you feel strongly about or something you've never really given much thought? Does seeing an actor you love brought back to the screen with computers make you clap and cheer and cry? Do you hate this stuff? Do you love this stuff? What are your favourite examples? What are your least favourite examples? Please let me know in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. If you did, please give it a like and share it with someone you think might also enjoy it. And remember to subscribe. I'm getting this channel back up and running and I'm ready to make videos about all kinds of things. I'll see you very soon. Love you lots.